have a long speech. My speeches are usually about 5 minutes. This one might run a little bit longer. I'm really pleased to be here today. We just arrived in Sweden and have not had a chance to even do any sightseeing or anything, so I'm really looking forward to being here for the next couple of days. And it's a very special honor for me to be invited to speak here and to have an opportunity to talk to you for a few minutes about one of my favorite subjects, which is mental health. And you should also know that I'm a little bit nervous because I come before you today not as a mental health professional or a scientist, but as a layperson who has spent many, many hours studying mental health needs of the people in our country. I think mental illness and mental health are topics that must concern us all, professional and laypersons. So today I want to share some of my thoughts with you in a spirit of exchange, with the hope that you will gain a better understanding of some of the accomplishments in our country and some of the problems. We are searching for effective ways in our country to improve the care of the mentally afflicted. Severe mental illness cripples the mind that is at the very heart of the human condition. It robs potential, devastates lives, and imposes misery on its victims, on their families, their friends, and neighbors. With our numbers in the millions across the face of the earth, the mentally ill present an enormous challenge to civilized society. And until that challenge is met, society is itself crippled by the loss of the contributions of these, our fellow citizens, the contributions that they could make to our well-being. My interest in mental health began to expand when my husband was elected governor of the state of Georgia in 1970. I had always worked. I had always been active in something. And I knew that when my husband was elected governor that I had to have something more to do than to pour tea. I did not intend to spend my time in the governor's mansion in that way. That's an important part of the position, but not a very fulfilling one for me. And I learned very soon that there are all kinds of opportunities available. A First Lady can pick and choose her projects, and she can be helpful in anything she chooses to do. Her name is a drawing card. She's influential with legislators. They might not always agree with a First Lady, but she can certainly always get their attention. And she has a built-in network of friends across the state, and she has access to the press. So it doesn't matter what field you choose as First Lady, you have some influence. And my first interest was mental health. We knew from my husband's days in the state Senate that there was so much that needed to be done in our state. And also I campaigned all across the state when my husband ran for governor, and I had seen firsthand that adequate services were not being provided in our state. So very soon after Jimmy was inaugurated as governor of Georgia, he formed a governor's commission to improve services to the mentally and emotionally handicapped. The purpose of the commission was to inventory the services provided in our state and determine what needed to be done to improve them. He appointed to the commission mental health professionals, laymen, parents, concerned citizens, and me. And thus began the learning process that was to cause me great concern for the weak and vulnerable human beings who need love and compassion and support, and who are often the last to be remembered when appropriations are being handed out in state budgets. In the beginning, I didn't know enough about mental illness or mental afflictions to be able to help in a substantive way with that committee. But I went to all of the meetings, and I began to do volunteer work in one of the regional hospitals, the mental hospitals close by. I went regularly to the hospital and was permitted to work in every area of the hospital. I found the work with emotionally disturbed children especially rewarding, although sometimes very frustrating when the progress was not as rapid as we would like for it to have been. I planted flower beds with elderly men and women from the geriatrics wards. I did follow-up work with alcoholics and drug addicts who had come to the hospital to dry out. I fed patients and read stories to them, and I watched them respond to attention. The hospital that I worked in was one of our newest in the state at that time, and one that we were very proud of. I also traveled for that first Governor's Commission I toured the state hospitals and reported back to the commission members what I found, not in a critical way, but in a constructive way so that we could determine the needs. I listened and I learned. I remember one of my first visits, it was to our main hospital for children. And it was a devastating experience for me. These were mentally retarded children, some profoundly retarded. And all day long I had to hold back the tears. I couldn't even talk or ask questions because I was choked up all day. And finally, when the tour was over, the superintendent said to me, "Mrs. Carter, I want you to come into my office for a moment." He closed the door behind us and said, "I've watched you all day, and I have to say one thing. Most mentally retarded people are happy. They do not know that they should be sad. If you're going to help at all, you must accept that and get over your tears. Don't let this get the best of you because we need you. We need your help." Well, it was surely a struggle. It didn't come naturally for me not to feel sorry for every single child that I saw and for every adult, many of whom spent their entire lives in the institutions, and for every disturbed young person who should be living a normal life and could, if we could just unlock whatever it was inside of him that caused him or her not to be able to function properly. But it developed over a period of time, the acceptance. And along with it, developed a determination to do whatever I could to help. If I had learned one thing for sure, and that is how totally dependent the mentally afflicted are on others, including me, for help. They have not the ability to care for themselves, and too often parents are influential and cannot be heard. There were some very good people in our state, as there are in states all across our country. Lay people, volunteers, including parents and professionals who are dedicated and with a total commitment to do all they can to help the mentally afflicted. These good people steered me through the early days of my education with patience and understanding. The Governor's Commission worked for months, and we formulated a report for the Governor in which we outlined a comprehensive plan to shift the emphasis of care away from the large institutions to the more intimate community mental health centers. This would allow those who are afflicted to live at home surrounded by loved ones and have somewhere to go during the day to learn and to be cared for. We wanted in our state a center within reach of every single person who needed help, and we almost developed that. We almost accomplished that. Our mental health system changed completely in the next 3 years. As Jimmy said in a speech during his last year as governor. So we changed the entire thrust of the department, and we now have more than 130 community treatment centers. We have 6,000 retarded children who are living at home at night at very little expense to the taxpayer and learning how to help their fathers or mothers around the house, around the business, around the farm, instead of being sent off as permanent wards of the taxpayer. They can get the love of their families as part of their reconstitution to a normal or partially normal life. From 23 community mental health centers when he was elected, the number jumped to 134, plus 23 group homes for the mildly retarded, who are those who should not be in institutions but have nowhere to go, no loved ones to care for them. We were treating 56% more mental patients, and the number of resident hospital patients during the last 3 years decreased by about 30%. So we were very, very pleased with what was accomplished during the time that my husband was governor of Georgia. Just for illustration, let's transform some of these perhaps dry statistics into human terms, and keep in mind that this was only one visit that I made to one center in our state. I drove one weekend to Ocilla, Georgia, in a rural area of our state to visit the Community Mental Health Center, and these are some of the people I met. A 3-year-old child whose parents were both deaf mutes, and who was always thought to have the same affliction, who had now begun to talk. One teenage girl who had spent her lifetime in a wheelchair, but had now become an excellent swimmer. And an elderly man who stuttered so that it was painful to listen to him try to talk. He was talking to me and he said, "I was the town crazy before this center opened. He had spent his life on the streets, taking handouts and causing trouble, but he had not missed a single day since that community mental health center had opened. And he kept the yards clean, and he worked on the inside. And everyone told me that they didn't know what they would do without him. And during the program, he was called on to sing, and he opened his mouth, and the words of "How Great Thou Art" poured forth without a stutter, pure and clear. And I cried. Jimmy implemented almost all of the plan outlined in the commission, and people came from all over the United States to see what we had done in Georgia. And I had to answer when people asked me what was the most rewarding thing you did as First Lady of Georgia. I have to say my work with mental health programs in our state. And I came away from that experience in Georgia convinced that much could be done to improve the way mental health services are organized and provided to those in need. Primarily, I was convinced that community-based care given near one's relatives and friends and home, should be encouraged and supported wherever possible. And then again, I campaigned this time across the nation in 1975 and 76 as wife of the candidate for President of the United States. And I had in my biographical sketch a sentence about my work with mental health in Georgia. So everywhere I went, of course, people wanted to show me their mental health center. If they had something good, they wanted me to see it. And if they had something that wasn't good, they wanted me to see it, because if my husband were elected president, they wanted some help. So I got to see good things and things that were not so good in our country. And I also realized that there were needs. There was a lack of services, particularly in the rural areas, in some of the rural areas in our country. So even before the election, I talked to Jimmy about a president's commission similar to the one that we had had in Georgia when he was governor. And one of his first official acts, as Dr. Wetterberg said, less than a month after he was inaugurated as president, he created the President's Commission on Mental Health and named me as honorary chairperson. I had to be honorary chairperson because it's against the law in our country for the wife of a president to be a chairman. I don't know why, but it was all right to be honorary chairperson, but not chairman. We had 20 members on the commission, and we were given a one-year mandate to identify how America's mentally ill was served or underserved, and then to identify, 1, the projected needs for dealing with emotional distress during the next 25 years, 2, the ways the President, Congress, and the federal government might most efficiently support the treatment of the underserved, 3, methods for coordinating a unified approach to all mental health and support services, 4, the types of research the federal government should support to further the prevention and treatment of mental illness and mental retardation, 5, the roles educational systems, voluntary agencies, and other institutions could perform to help minimize emotional disturbances, and 6, to the extent possible, the cost of mental health programs, how the money should be spent, and how financing should be divided among federal, state, and local governments and the private and philanthropic sectors. As you can see, our task was not simple. It was exceedingly complex, but we undertook it with great enthusiasm. And these books you see here are the report. And we had many, many people who worked to make that report possible. We didn't have very much money. My husband was president, but he only allocated a small amount of funds. But we went to people in the whole country and got help anywhere we went. It was really a wonderful experience. Not since the days of John F. Kennedy had there been a comprehensive study done of the mental health care and the mental health needs in our country. During that time, the federal government had greatly expanded its role in assuring that the needs of the mentally ill would be addressed. Prior to this, the states had had total responsibility. But this movement to improve care at the national level had begun with the onset of World War II, when medical screening of those called for military service revealed a startlingly high level of rejection for psychiatric disability. The striking prevalence of serious mental or emotional illness raised concern about the state of knowledge of the causes of mental illness. And so the next 2 decades then, when interest was aroused, and we had in the White House a president who was concerned about mental illness. The 60s, beginning in the 60s and the 70s were exciting years in the mental health field. Investments in research around the world bore fruit with the development of more effective drugs for the treatment of the mentally ill, new behavioral therapies, and greater insights into how the brain functions. During these years, there developed in America a strong national consensus that the care for the mentally ill could indeed be improved, that it could be provided in decent, community-based settings by highly skilled professionals, and significantly, that many, many seriously mentally ill individuals could live and function well outside institutions, provided follow-up care and supportive services were available to them. Much progress was made in the care that was provided in our country during these 2 decades. Yet our study, the study that we began in 1977, convinced the members of the President's Commission that a substantial number of Americans still did not have access to mental health care of high quality and at reasonable cost. For many, this was because of where they lived, as I said earlier, in rural areas especially. For others, it was because of who they were, their race or age or sex. Children were neglected to a large extent, the elderly. For still others, it was because of their particular disability or economic circumstance. Our commission presented to the President recommendations that would make possible adequate care for all persons that needed help. We worked hours and hours and hours. I studied in detail, not every report, because we had 34 committees with more than 450 people serving on those committees who sent us volumes of information and papers. And I'll have to admit that I didn't read all of it, but I did go to all of the hearings when they reported to the committee and read the material, the summary material, and so that I would have an understanding of it. Legislation was drawn up to encompass the recommendations that we made to the President. I worked with the Cabinet Secretaries in drawing up this legislation. And then once the legislation was presented to Congress, I went to the Capitol and appeared before the congressional committees to lobby for the legislation. And in 1980, the Mental Health Systems Act became law. Unfortunately, with the change of administrations, all of the things that we had envisioned have not come to pass. In fact, some of the legislation, to my regret, has been repealed, but the study is still there to serve as a guide, and I am confident that over a period of time, it will all become law, and it will all be implemented. The mental health system of America is still in a state of evolution. It combines public and private personnel, facilities and financing without clearly established lines of responsibility and accountability. While there is much that is good, there is much that needs improvement. This is especially true of people with chronic mental illness. That was one of our main concerns in our report, was a good program for the chronically mentally ill. It's true of many children and adolescents and older Americans, and of the poor, many of whom are members of racial minorities. The plight of the chronically mentally ill illustrates the difficulties that still exist. These people with severe mental disabilities, which often persist throughout their lives, have very special needs, but their needs are not always identical. Some require a sheltered environment, some need a variety of supporting social services, while some need only periodic assistance. There are still others who achieve a high level of independent functioning. As a group, they are the individuals who in earlier times would have been the residents in the large state mental institutions. And they are the ones that were supposed to benefit the most from the shift to the community center. But in many instances, the chronically mentally ill were released from the hospitals to go to the communities before adequate services were provided in the communities. And the deinstitutionalization of the chronically mentally ill brought with it its own problems, as in city after city, thousands of individuals led lives of cyclical despair, in and out of institutions, sporadic medical care, inadequate living arrangements, wandering from temporary shelter from one to another. And so what our commission found was in many ways a perplexing paradox. Millions of Americans had access to better mental health care than ever before, yet hundreds of thousands with the most severe, debilitating types of mental illness were leading lives of desperation. Unfortunately, the problems we face in America are not uncommon around the world. One of the prime reasons this is true relates to the very nature of severe mental illness. It's not attractive. In fact, it's often very unattractive. And moreover, the thought of mental illness in ourselves or our family, our friends, sometimes strikes chords of fear and dread. These fears and suspicions, many based on myths, are as old as mankind, and they are deeply ingrained. But they must be faced and they must be dealt with, or we cannot hope to make the kind of progress that should be made in meeting our obligations to the mentally ill. As I said in a speech at the World Health Assembly in Geneva in May of 1979, fear and superstition hold back our progress. There is resistance to the idea of community care for the mentally ill. People are afraid to have patients or former patients as their neighbors because they worry that they might be dangerous or irresponsible, that violence will increase and their children might be harmed. It was just amazing to me when we had our mental health commission and had hearings across the country to listen to the people that talk and tell us about mental health problems. And we talked to people who, in communities who had, where group homes were trying to be established. And they were afraid of the people, afraid there would be violence. It was very distressing to me. The stigma attached to mental illness is so great that many are afraid or ashamed. Many of those of the mentally ill are afraid or ashamed to seek help. And others hide the fact that they have received treatment. We had a really wonderful experience in our church in Plains just a few weeks ago. We had a group of mentally disabled people who were touring from a center in another state. And they came to the church to perform for us. And they made beautiful music by ringing bells, and it was a handbell choir, and each one had to ring the bell at just the right time to make the music, and they did it, and it was beautiful. And one girl who had a really twisted hand and a terribly distorted face was an accomplished pianist. She played her own compositions. And there was one man, he was not a young man, he was an older man, who stood up and recited a poem, a very long poem, in a very dramatic way. And the people in our church that came to hear them were moved. They had not seen this before. They did not know what mentally afflicted people could do. And how helpful it would be, how helpful it was to our community. Our community was inspired, and how helpful if instances like this could occur more often. They helped so much with the stigma. I heard so many people in our church that day say, I know what I'm going to do with my contributions from now on. I'm going to give them to help the mentally ill. And that was just one visit to a small community of Plains, Georgia. So the more people know and the more we can get across to the public that mentally afflicted people can develop their skills and that they are people and that everybody has problems. Some people handle them better than others. And if we can get that across to the public, we can go so far toward helping solve the problems because once people are interested, they want to be helpful. I'm sure that you need not be reminded that public attitudes about mental illness and treatment hamper all of us. Until we change this aura of ignorance and prejudice, until the general public is better informed about mental illness, efforts to improve care will too often be in vain. Until the public better understands what appropriate kinds of treatment can and cannot accomplish, then our efforts to make appropriate treatment available will be hampered. And until the public better understands the potential value of basic scientific inquiry and research, efforts to generate support for that research will be thwarted. I come before you today chiefly as an advocate for better public educational efforts, aimed at making the general public our active partners in the important work that lies ahead. Somehow we must devise more effective ways of communicating what we know, that mental illness takes many forms and comes from many causes, that appropriate treatment should be available to all who need it, that treatment doesn't always cure, but that it can most often surely help relieve pain and suffering, that care must be provided in ways that protect the basic human rights of those afflicted with mental illness, that a venturesome worldwide program of basic research must be supported. For only with new knowledge about how the brain functions can we hope to identify underlying causes and to develop more effective treatment for those manifestations of mental illness which, given current understanding, appear to be intractable. With that new knowledge, we will be able to mount better programs of early detection and prevention so that mental illness can be halted before it begins to take its awful toll. There is, of course, one additional element that is absolutely crucial. It is the spirit of caring. The citizens of the world must be led to care, so that those millions who suffer from mental disabilities need not be sentenced to lives of chronic despair. I had a chance to meet many times with my friend, the late social anthropologist Margaret Mead, and she always referred to the mentally ill as the most vulnerable among us. The most vulnerable among us. Highly skilled and trained professionals like yourselves, and those of you who will in the future be highly skilled, and your colleagues around the world must join forces with our fellow citizens to address this vulnerability. For the good of all mankind, we must not allow it to continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mrs. Carter. And now the director of the Karolinska Institute, Bengt Pernow, wants to say a few words. Bengt Pernow.
Well, Mrs. Carter, I would just like to thank you on behalf of the audience for your most inspiring lecture, which illustrated in a very nice way your personal interest in the improvement of mental health. We are very pleased and honored that you were able to accept our invitation to come to us and give this lecture. And for your memory, and as a small sign of our appreciation, I'm happy to give you this small medal of the Karolinska Institute. Thank you.
Maybe the director will escort you out to the library, and then I'll give some instruction to the audience here. So if you
See you all at
is this your